The state of emergency, enemy of Western freedoms. That is the topic of today's English podcast on May the 14th, 2026. This is the management of reality. All right, let's get right into it. The state of emergency. What is the state of emergency? Let's define it first. I have here a handy definition that I get from Wikipedia, which is this Wikipedia definition is no worse than any other, so it'll do. It says, a state of emergency is a situation in which a government is empowered to be able to put through policies that it would normally not be permitted to do for the safety and protection of its citizens. A government can declare such a state during a natural disaster, civil unrest, armed conflict, medical pandemic or epidemic, or other biosecurity risk. Rights and freedoms may be suspended during a state of emergency, depending on the severity of the emergency. End of quote. All right. This should remind you of a very famous quote from Benjamin Franklin that goes as follows, quote, those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. That statement by Ben Franklin is a direct challenge to the entire idea of the state of emergency, because in the state of emergency, what you're doing is you're purchasing a little temporary safety, or at least that's what you think. This is what this promised to you. They promise you temporary safety in exchange for essential liberty. And Ben Franklin says if you make that trade, you deserve neither liberty nor safety. Now, let's find out if Ben Franklin is right, or at least let's find out what I think about that. All right. So the principle invoked in the state of emergency is the same principle that your friend invokes when he throws you to save you from a passing bus. Okay? Your friend violates you in a sense because he doesn't ask your permission, but only by throwing you can he protect you. In a state of emergency, the government, your friend, similarly apologizes for violating you, for suspending your rights and freedoms. Because this is necessary, the government alleges, to protect you. Now, let me point out the relevant differences. I mean, because the metaphor works for how the government presents the situation to you, okay? The metaphor with your friend and the bus, it works for that. But you need to make a note of the important differences, and these are three. First, you know your friend. Your relationship with your friend is built on gobs of information, okay? Otherwise, he's not your friend. He's just an acquaintance or somebody you just met. If he's your friend, the relationship is based on a lot of information. It's personal. By contrast, the bureaucrats who make state-level decisions, you don't know them. There's no personal relationship. You are an abstraction to them, and they are an abstraction to you. Second difference, you can see the bus that almost crushed you. It is concrete. There is zero doubt that a danger existed and that your friend acted to save you. The determination of a state-level emergency, by contrast, is abstract. Even when you can see a concrete danger, it may still be highly ambiguous whether that danger rises to a sufficiently dangerous emergency above the constitutional threshold, okay? And the information asymmetry between those making that determination and you, the ordinary citizen, is vast. It is abysmal, okay? The state bureaucrats have way more information than you, okay? So Whereas your friend and you're mostly using the same information, and there's no the bus. He can't make up a bus. There's a bus there. You see it, right? Third difference. Your friend does not become immensely powerful with his emergency behaviors. He does not enslave you. By contrast, state bureaucrats do become immensely powerful with their emergency behaviors. In some cases, they become all-powerful, utterly enslaving you, the citizen. So what follows? Well, let's build the syllogism. You know what? I'll put the syllogism up on the screen so that we are perfectly transparent and you can follow this no problem, because that's how arguments should be presented, with the utmost transparency. So let me just share here. Here we go. Okay, I'm gonna paste it here. Yeah, here. Okay. So let's make this a little bigger. That's good. All right. I don't know why it pasted it twice, but here we go. This always happens because I am a moron. Here we go. Okay. So premise number one, bureaucrats in a democratic state have a giant incentive to exaggerate and prolong a real emergency or to manufacture an entirely phony emergency. Why? Well, because the state of emergency can confer at the limit totalitarian power on those state bureaucrats. Okay? Premise number two, state bureaucrats have ample opportunity to exaggerate and prolong a real emergency or to manufacture a phony emergency. Why? Because, as we just said, the state bureaucrats enjoy a tremendous information asymmetry advantage vis-a-vis the ordinary citizen. So the conclusion from these premises is that the state of emergency will probably be abused, undermining democracy. Now, as with any syllogism, the conclusion is weakened if you weaken the premises. So if, for example, the emergency powers granted, are carefully limited and for a brief period, and or if the quality of information, if quality information reliably reaches the citizens, right, then abuses of power in a state of emergency may be relatively constrained. Okay, so I'm not saying the danger is always the same. Obviously, to the extent that emergency powers granted to a government are greater, the danger is greater, right? To that extent, the danger is greater. So I'm not going to deny that there's a continuum here. Of course there is. But the deeper point is this. Although the provision for a state of emergency in a democratic constitution is invariably framed as necessary for the state bureaucrats, your friends, to act for your protection, I think that protection argument is not the one you should be really thinking of as a citizen. I think it is more adaptive for you to see in the state of emergency not your protection, but your vulnerability. This vulnerability follows from the concentration of power that a state of emergency produces. Because the following is what I call a hard and fast sociological rule. Power is abused. Lord Acton very famously said it like this. He said, quote, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Great men are almost always bad men," end of quote. That was Lord Acton. But the observation is hardly new. It's not an observation that is original for modern times and modern people such as Lord Acton. When the ancient Israelites, who had they had an acephalous system, in other words, a decentralized system, right? They had the ancient Israelites, according to the Bible, had a system that decentralized power to judges. Okay, and at this time, says the book of Samuel, the Israelites came to the prophet Samuel and demanded to be like other nations. And they said, we want to have a king just like other nations that have kings. And Samuel replied, well, if I give you a king, he will make you his slaves. And he went on to detail all the ways that the king would oppress them, right? What is the implicit argument? You've got a society where power is dissipated to a bunch of judges. You want to concentrate power in a king? Then you're going to be oppressed. Why? Because power is abused, and the more you concentrate it, the more abuse you're going to get. Okay? So this idea that power is abused, I'm going to consider it self-evident. All right? I'm going to consider it an axiom of political life. And this axiom has a corollary, which I just said. The more, if power is going to be abused, then the more you concentrate power, the more abuse you're going to get. Now, why is power abused? Well, I agree with the great liberal theorist Friedrich Bastiat, who simply said it's human nature. You know, it's part of the psychological design of the human species that if you give someone power, and there's no check on that power, they're gonna abuse it. This is what Friedrich Bastiat said, and I quote. He says, "A disposition common to humans is to live and to develop when they can at the expense of one another. This is no rash imputation emanating from a gloomy, uncharitable spirit. Rather, history bears witness to the truth of it by the incessant wars, the migrations of races, sectarian oppressions, the universality of slavery, the frauds in trade, and the monopolies with which its annals abound. This fatal disposition has its origin in the very constitution of man, in that primitive and universal and invisible sentiment that urges him towards his own well-being and makes him seek to escape pain." End of quote. So it is an axiom of human social life that power is going to be abused because it is human nature to abuse power. Okay, this is the, let us say, this is my fundamental point of departure. Now, this axiom that power is abused, and its corollary that the more you concentrate power, the greater the abuse, jointly support the libertarian suspicion of the state. Disclosure, I'm a libertarian. Okay, so we libertarians are always suspicious of the state. Why? Because the state concentrates power, right? So even those libertarians who grudgingly accept some form of state, we consider it always a necessary evil, right? Now, the same axiom and corollary reveal why communist government repeatedly produces totalitarianism. Not because Marxism has never been done right, as so many stubborn leftists believe, but because communists concentrate all power in the state. And the inevitable result of concentrating all power in one place is tyranny. Why? Because power is abused. The more you concentrate it, the more abuse you get, right? So the reason communism produces totalitarianism reliably is not that communism, it hasn't been done right. It's because if you concentrate power, no matter what your original intentions are, you're going to end up producing tyranny because power is abused. Okay? All right. Now, here's an interesting, what I think is an interesting discovery, or at least for me it is. A totalitarian communist government is functionally indistinguishable from a full powers state of emergency, indefinitely extended. Or if you wish, the state of emergency is a form of compressed communism. Why? Because in both cases, citizens are being told that only by the power of coercion can they be protected. And in both cases, the protection argument can easily be abused by unscrupulous elites to impose totalitarianism, right? So you can look at this at the two sides of this coin, right? Communism is like a fully powerful and indefinitely extended state of emergency, or the state of emergency is a form of compressed communism. It's a moment of communism, right? If it doesn't last forever, right, then it's a moment of communism, because in the state of emergency, you are arguing, like communists do, that in order to protect the citizen, you have to give all the power to the state, all right? Now, there's a difference, though, between the state of emergency and communism, and it is a big one. And that is that communists are explicitly revolutionary. They're always talking about conflict, about oppressors and victims, bad guys, good guys. This language is always, let us say, it is obligatory in communist rhetoric. And since they're always talking about conflict and violent overthrow, they're coming. And if they're coming because of the way they talk, they say they're coming. They say they're going to do a violent revolution. They say they're going to coerce everybody to give up their money, right? They're saying this out loud, right? The fact that they are transparent about this improves the chances of a timely anti-communist counteroffensive. By contrast, the state of emergency is sneaky. It gives state bureaucrats the opportunity to enslave you without seeming to, without paying the price of showing you in advance their totalitarian hand. And that is precisely why Western civilization cannot afford the state of emergency provision in our constitutions. That will be my argument, okay? So before I lay it out, I want to make something very clear. I understand that getting rid of the state of emergency will entail important costs. This is true. I'm not going to weasel out of that. To not have a provision for a state of emergency will somewhat tie the hands of the government when it comes to responding to various kinds of emergencies. I agree that this is true, and I agree that this imposes costs on the citizenry. Of course it does. But what I am arguing is that the costs of keeping the state of emergency provision in our constitutions are far larger, far larger, okay? So this is how my argument should be evaluated. You can't dismiss my argument by saying, oh, but there are costs to getting rid of the state of emergency. I agree. There's going to be some costs. But keeping the state of emergency provision in our constitutions is way more costly. Okay? Now, how do I defend my argument? Well, let's begin with World War II, because I think World War II is the most important test case, although I have another one that I will mention in a second. The global war of conquest launched by the Nazis against liberty and democracy cost more than 70 million lives, according to the latest estimates that I have seen. On top of that, hundreds of millions of Westerners who were not killed lost their basic rights and liberties under totalitarian government, which was a consequence of the Nazi conquest. What made this catastrophe possible? Of course, many things. Many things made it possible. I'm not reducing World War II to one cause. But it is fair to say that the constitutional provision for the state of emergency was not the least of the causes of World War II. It was a very important cause, okay? I'm now going to quote the Wiener Holocaust Library, which is explaining this relationship between the state of emergency and everything that happened. Okay? And what the Wiener Holocaust Library says is that barely a month after Adolf Hitler was named Chancellor of Germany, and I quote, on the 28th of February, 1933, President Hindenburg signed the emergency decree for the protection of the German people. That's a title. That's the title of the decree. Emergency decree for the protection of the German people. I continue with the quote. This decree suspended the democratic aspects of the Weimar Republic and declared a state of emergency. This decree gave the Nazis a legal basis for the persecution and oppression of any opponents who were to be framed as traitors to the Republic. People could be imprisoned for any or no reason. The decree also removed basic personal freedoms, such as the freedom of speech, the right to own property, and the right to trial before imprisonment. Through these aspects, the Nazis suppressed any opposition to their power and were able to start the road from democracy to a dictatorship. End of quote. Paul von Hindenburg, the president of Germany who signed that emergency decree, was not the greatest fan of democracy, but neither was he a Nazi. As president of the Weimar Republic, that is, of the liberal democratic system that governed Germany between the two world wars, Hindenburg was like a constitutional monarch with mostly ceremonial powers. But he did have the power to declare a state of emergency. Why did he? Why did he declare that state of emergency? Well, because he was old and uncertain, and he was scared by the political violence that was gripping Weimar Germany at that time. Now, significantly, for the argument I'm defending, it happens to be a well-documented fact that the Nazi brown shirts and their far-right paramilitary allies, the Freikorps soldiers and so forth, appear to have been the most important drivers of political violence in Germany. So yeah, there was a crisis of political violence inside Germany for sure. But it was the Nazis who were responsible for producing most of it. And it was agents of the Nazis who worked hard privately to scare Hindenburg, President von Hindenburg, into declaring the state of emergency. The immediate trigger for the state of emergency decree was the Reichstag fire, the famous Reichstag fire. The Reichstag is the building that houses the German parliament, okay? And somebody set it on fire. Now, it is significant also that many suspect the Reichstag fire was a Nazi plot. Now, whatever the truth on authorship, I'm convinced it was the Nazis, but whatever the truth on authorship, what is undisputed is that the Reichstag fire happened immediately after, or very soon after Adolf Hitler was made Chancellor of Germany. And second, it is also undisputed that the Nazis blamed the fire on an alleged communist revolutionary plot and used that allegation to support their insistence that only by declaring a state of emergency could Germany be, avoid catastrophe. Now, keeping to the grammatical and therefore obligatory etiquette, which requires that the state promise protection for the citizens, right? This is obligatory. Keeping to that grammatical obligation, Hindenburg signed a decree that, as I said, is named Emergency Decree for the Protection of the German People. But this decree, instead of protecting anybody, made the German people maximally vulnerable, because the Nazis were the party that got to exercise this emergency authority. And the Germans were destroyed. They were destroyed. Others, many others, would also be destroyed. It was a profusion of violence without any precedent in human history. Okay, and it was made possible in part by the state of emergency provision. I'm going to give you a second example. COVID. Specific theories have been advanced to allege deliberate manipulation and deception on the part of authorities for every single component of the COVID crisis. The origin of the virus, the severity of the medical danger, the size of the public emergency, the numbers of casualties, the safety and effectiveness of the COVID vaccines, the efficacy of the alternative treatments, and the rationale for the draconian policies imposed. For every one of these, specific theories have been advanced and a lot of documentation to defend the view that there was deliberate manipulation and deception in each of those things on the part of the authorities. These claims of manipulation and deception have become increasingly well supported by the emerging evidence, leading some to perceive organization at the macro level. In other words, many people now perceive that there was a concerted manipulation and deception, that it is not a coincidence that we keep finding evidence of manipulation and deception in all of these different aspects of the COVID crisis. Okay, many people perceive that there was an architecture of manipulation and deception, and that it was all articulated. For starters, the virus responsible for the COVID crisis is almost certainly a product of gain-of-function research in the Wuhan lab in China, as a consequence of both Chinese research and money and US government research and money. Okay, so that's one point. Another point is that authorities employed an epidemiological model that many times before had conjured entirely false pandemics out of nothing. And they used that same model as the alleged scientific authority to explain the catastrophe that was upon us, allegedly, and to justify their emergency policies. I'm gonna share with you the articles we have on this, because I shouldn't forget to do that, and you should have the opportunity to look at the evidence we have put together on this, which is impressive. Now we're of course not the only ones investigating the COVID crisis, but now allow me to find this. Where is this? No, this is not going to work out. Hold on. I need to find this first. So, oh, apparently it's not here at all. Okay, well, I will put them in the description. That way we won't waste time with this right now. I will pull all of these in the description. So, the draconian emergency policies implemented had no precedent in the history of epidemic response. They were argued for on the basis of the urgency of protection, of course, but they imposed costs far larger than the alleged benefits, and we have an article on that too. Both the severity of the disease and the numbers of casualties were exaggerated upward, ludicrously, in order to promote and then to keep the draconian emergency policies in place. We have an article on that. What was the result? The result was that Western citizens were confined in their homes unless the government gave them permission. And they were unable to travel, visit public spaces, and sometimes even to work unless they consented to be vaccinated, quote unquote, with an experimental genetic intervention. Many millions were impoverished. A great many were killed. Untold numbers were sickened. and not by the virus, but by the, well, yes, by the virus, some of them, and then many, many more were sickened, even worse, by the so-called vaccines, right? We were made slaves. Let's not minimize it. We were made slaves. We lost sovereignty even over our own bodies. The sacrosanct principle enshrined in the Nuremberg Code, which was created after the medical atrocities of the Nazis in World War II, which says that we cannot be medically experimented on without our consent, was violated for millions and millions and millions of people. We were made slaves. Those responsible for mobilizing the entire public health machinery against the democratic citizens of the West made many billions of dollars by the maneuver. And we have an article explaining that. And here's the clincher. They tried all of this before. We have another article where we document for you that back in 2005, nobody remembers this, back in 2005, with George W. Bush, the US government prepared a comprehensive plan to shut everything down and declare martial law on the basis of a pandemic scare. 2005, way before COVID. The only problem in 2005 is that the virus that they chose that year, though it initially looked promising, didn't kill people, like almost nobody. So they had to pack up the entire show. But of course, they would try again, and they did, and they will again. There's going to be another epidemic scare, I can guarantee you that. Although that's, of course, not the only way they can scare us. Now, very important in this discussion is to understand that the state of emergency provision interacts with political culture. Okay? Ask yourself, why did the Nazis want an emergency decree? Why not just impose themselves violently, since they were violent already? And the answer is because the state of emergency gambit produces less resistance from the citizenry. And that lowers the risk for the would-be totalitarian usurpers. Think about it. All paid employees of state bureaucracies in a modern democracy are trained to follow lawful orders. If the state of emergency is lawfully declared, most will accept it. The same goes for most of the citizens. The general acceptance of a lawful state of emergency by state employees and the bulk of the citizenry is precisely what allows the top state bureaucrats to exercise emergency powers. We saw this very clearly in the COVID crisis. So I'm going to cite philosopher Giorgio Agamben. He's an Italian philosopher who reflected on this. And I quote, he says, "The ease with which an entire society has acquiesced," so he's expressing astonishment at, quote, "the ease with which an entire society has acquiesced to feeling itself plague-stricken, to isolating itself at home, and to suspending its normal conditions of life, its relationships of work, friendship, love, and even its religious and political convictions," end of quote. I agree with Agamben that this was indeed striking, or at least it was striking for those of us who noticed that the behavior of health bureaucrats was truly odd. But it was only striking for those of us who did notice that something very strange was going on, right? Agamben asks, and I quote, "Why were there no protests and opposition, as is usually the case in these situations?" End of quote. And that's where he loses me. What can he possibly mean? As is usually the case? In which situations? Yes, if people are simply coerced, they may revolt, though not always. But what happened in COVID was not simple coercion. This was a state of emergency argued, as it always is, on the basis of protection. What happened in COVID was that health bureaucrats declared a medical emergency And most ordinary folk assumed that health bureaucrats acted with proper scientific rigor and in good faith. In that prevailing ideology, they concluded that health bureaucrats should be obeyed. The state of emergency was perceived as legitimate. And that's what explains the docility. We hardly need Agamben's highfalutin, quote unquote, hypothesis, as he calls it, that people agreed to lock themselves down because they were already, quote unquote, intolerable to each other, as he claims, and simply manifested this latent hatred. Please, the explanation is very obvious. If you think that the authorities are your friends and they are acting in good faith, and they have the title of health bureaucrat, and they tell you that according to their expert opinion, there's a great danger, you, the ordinary citizen, in this ideological framework where the state of emergency is a legitimate provision in our constitutions, most of us simply assume, well, they must be doing the right thing. So we will accept the state of emergency and we will obey their orders. It's as simple as that. You don't need a more complicated hypothesis. Now, crucial here is that if top state bureaucrats use citizen-granted emergency powers quickly and deftly, they can transform the institutional structure so as to make the emergency powers permanent. And you know, from that point onward, they will protect those emergency powers by developing a radical force asymmetry with respect to the citizenry. And this is precisely what the Nazis did. So the deeper point here is that at root, what makes possible this sneaky transfer of sovereignty under cover of emergency is the distribution of ideas in the population concerning legitimate state behavior. So the ideas that millions of people have in their heads about what is and isn't legitimate state behavior is precisely what makes it possible for state bureaucrats to sneakily wrench or wrest sovereignty from the citizens to themselves without seeming to, because what they're claiming to do is that they're protecting you, okay? It only works because we have a particular theory of legitimate state behavior in our heads. If the distribution of ideas about legitimate state behavior is very different, then we can make things a lot harder for would-be totalitarians who would like to slip a fast one by us and sneakily establish totalitarianism. So on that note, I'll invite you to imagine a counterfactual modern Western history, one that didn't happen. So imagine that as Western societies transitioned into democracy in the last couple of centuries, imagine that they had enshrined in their constitutions the following imperative. Perhaps it's the first or second article, right? One or two, so that it's clear to the citizens that this is very important. I'm going to put it on the screen so that you can read it. This one I do have. I have it right here. Let's see. So imagine this article, okay? As article, oh, forgive me, as Article 1 of a liberal democratic constitution. Under no circumstances will any institution of this republic be allowed to declare a state of emergency that suspends the constitutional rights of the citizens. Any attempt to declare such a state of emergency for whatever reason must be interpreted by the citizenry as a threat to the basic democratical survival of the republic. If a grave danger to the health and safety of the citizens is perceived, state bureaucrats are allowed to inform, recommend, and cajole the citizenry, and they may employ the powers already granted to mitigate the danger. But no institution of the republic may, for any reason, including a claim to be protecting or saving the citizenry, suspend the constitutional rights of the citizens. For those state bureaucrats without emergency powers will find it more difficult to respond to some dangers, they will also find it more difficult to extinguish citizen rights and liberties, and no greater danger exists than the loss of liberty itself. Imagine that were Article 1 of your Constitution. Imagine that were Article 1. In a world like that, the citizens would be brought up in an educational system that teaches them to see the very attempt to declare a state of emergency as suspect and illegitimate. For the law makes no provision for it and instead warns the citizens against it. In fact, it prohibits it. If Article 1 of Germany's Weimar Constitution of 1919 had said something like that, and if the importance of that first article had been a major component of civic education, the Germans would have known to recognize in the emergency powers appeal to trade liberty for protection the on-ramp for totalitarianism. In such a civilization, the Nazis would have had a much tougher fight on their hands. And perhaps we would have avoided World War II. Don't forget that the Nazis were not inevitable. They had only captured about a third of the German vote at their peak. And their popularity was already waning past that peak when they went for the state of emergency gambit. Without that gambit, they really might have failed, especially considering that in the early days of the Nazi regime, their ideology sparked an international boycott that almost destroyed the Third Reich in the cradle. And we have an article on that too. We'll put it in the description. So now ask yourself this question, for this is the crux. What catastrophe, costlier than World War II, has the state of emergency provision saved us from? I can't think of one. It is commonly said that World War II is the worst thing that has ever happened to humanity. If you accept that, then by definition, there is no catastrophe that the state of emergency provision has ever saved us from that is costlier than World War II. But the state of emergency provision did give us World War II. Or consider this. Sometimes I hear people say that COVID did more harm than World War II. For example, this is the opinion expressed by World Health Organization Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus. I believe that's how you pronounce his name. Now that's a cheeky opinion for him to make, because he's one of the people most responsible for the COVID mess. I don't know whether he's right about that. I don't think Ghebreyesus knows either, whether COVID was worse for humanity than World War II. I don't know how to evaluate that. And I don't think he knows either. But the mere fact that he compares COVID to World War II puts the COVID crisis in the category of greatest ever harm, okay? It's in that category with World War II. And that matters because the COVID crisis is likewise in the category of harm imposed via the abuse of emergency measures. So let me ask this question as well. What catastrophe, costlier than COVID, has the state of emergency provision saved us from? I don't believe you can name even one. In which case, I submit the following for consideration. A civilization for which emergency powers are a hard taboo where the idea of a state of emergency is unthinkable. That civilization, I claim, will suffer less harm overall than a civilization with state of emergency provisions in its democratic constitutions. Now, I'm going to wrap this up with a little bit of political theory. I'm going to fit this into the literature that we have on political theory. When can we say that the democratic citizenry is sovereign? When can we say that the citizens are really sovereign, like we claim they want, like we claim that we want them to be in modern liberal democratic theory, right? When can we say that the citizens are truly sovereign? I'll try to answer this question by beginning with the famous political theorist Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt founded his entire theory of sovereignty on the issue of the state of emergency, so he is quite relevant here. In his famous political theology, his opening statement was, sovereign, quote, sovereign is he who decides on the exception, end of quote. The term the exception is more or less synonymous with the state of emergency. So Schmitt says state of exception to mean that the normal constitutional order is suspended, okay? In a liberal constitutional democracy, the suspension of the constitutional order is juridically established by alleging an emergency. However, emergency and its specific remedies, as Schmitt points out, cannot be exhaustively nor minutely defined in advance. He says, and I quote, it can neither be stated with subsumable clarity when an emergency will exist, nor can it be substantially enumerated what might happen in such a case when it truly comes to an extreme emergency and its elimination, end of quote. In other words, the state of emergency is declared on the basis of a rather flexible interpretation. Whoever has the power to make this interpretation, which suspends the constitutional order, says Schmitt, is the true sovereign. This makes a lot of sense. He says, the sovereign is, quote, he who will decide immediately whether an extreme emergency exists, as well as what should be done to eliminate it, end of quote. Now, there appears to be a problem in this formulation because Schmitt collapses two powers into the same institution or person. You can see this by considering the example of Weimar Germany. For there, it was the president, that's an institution, and specifically in that case, in that moment, it was Hindenburg, that's the person, right, who had the power to sign the emergency decree. The president, Hindenburg, he had the power to say there is a state of emergency. But it was the chancellor, a different institution, and in that moment occupied by Hitler, who wielded the extraordinary emergency powers once the state of emergency was declared. Okay? So the two aspects of sovereignty that Schmitt is identifying, deciding, the power to decide on the exception and the power to wield the emergency powers, were not located in the same institution or person. That seems to be a problem. Now, can Schmittian theory wiggle out of this? I think it can. It's not too much of a problem. All you have to say is that Hindenburg was sovereign until he signed the emergency decree. Because until that moment, it was he who decided on the exception. Okay? Thereafter, though Hindenburg technically retained the juridical authority to annul his own decree and restore the constitutional order, he lost the material power to do so because Hitler quickly exercised his emergency powers to make the state respond to him personally. It was now Hitler, therefore, who decided on the exception, and he extended that exception, the state of emergency, indefinitely. he was now the sovereign. So with these qualifications, I would say that Schmidt is still right. But we need to keep our eye on sovereignty, located, yes, as the power to decide on the exception, as a ball that can in principle be transferred rather quickly from one player to another, as it was in the case of the transfer from Hindenburg to Hitler, okay? But now, accepting Schmidt's definition that of sovereignty as the power to decide on the exception, let us ask, when is the democratic citizenry sovereign? If sovereignty is the power to decide on the exception, the power to suspend the Constitution, right? When is the democratic citizenry sovereign? And I propose the following principle. The democratic citizenry, so hard to pronounce, my tongue can no longer speak English. The democratic citizenry is sovereign only when the attempt to impose the exception, the state of emergency, is reflexively, that is axiomatically, treated as usurpation. I will repeat. The democratic citizenry is sovereign only when the attempt to impose the exception, the state of emergency, is reflexively, that is axiomatically, treated as usurpation. In other words, to make the democratic citizenry sovereign, we need the democratic constitution itself and the civic education of the citizenry to jointly build a culture in which the citizen learns to regard anyone who attempts to suspend the constitutional rights and liberties on whatever pretext as a danger to the citizens, precisely according to the text of my proposed constitutional article, which I put in the screen just a few moments earlier. When the attempt to impose a state of emergency on any grounds is by definition extra-constitutional and therefore illegal, any move in this direction is automatically a warning and alarm to politically aware citizens. But they must be politically aware, which is why citizen sovereignty is not merely a matter of constitutional design, but one of civic education that produces widespread political literacy. Put another way, if sovereignty is revealed in the exception, then only when state employees and citizens alike regard the state of emergency as fundamentally illegitimate can the citizens be considered sovereign. In this condition, the attempt to establish the exception becomes the legitimate trigger for disobedience and revolt for state employees and citizens alike. And it is this, the credible threat of disobedience and revolt in defense of citizen values, in defense of the political grammar of modern liberal democracy, that reminds the state bureaucrat or whoever lords it over the state bureaucrat that the citizens are sovereign. Only by this credible reminder are they truly sovereign. I am proposing, therefore, an inversion of traditional liberal theory. Traditional liberalism says that the emergency legitimizes suspension of constitutional rights and liberties. I am saying, to the contrary, that the preservation of our citizens' freedoms requires a radically libertarian frame in which claims of emergency have the opposite effect. They legitimize citizen resistance to the bureaucratic exercise of power. Now, I have to be very clear about what I'm not saying. I am not saying that an emergency response by the government to danger is illegitimate. What I am saying is that an emergency response by the government that tramples on citizen rights and liberties is illegitimate. Of course, if there is a danger, the government should respond. And it should respond on an emergency basis if it is a great danger, of course. But the emergency, however defined, can never justify trampling citizen rights and liberties. So do your job as best you can, but you cannot suspend my rights and liberties, okay? Now, my formulation is in basic agreement with the views of important liberal theorists. For example, John Locke wrote that, quote, wherever law ends, tyranny begins, end of quote. He was quite general in his formulation. In Locke's view, if a constituted authority violates the law on any point, on that point, the citizen may legitimately resist. Though Locke does not formulate an explicit theory on the state of emergency itself, we can extend his views to consider it. The state of emergency is, at the limit, the abrogation of all law, and therefore, by Locke's definition, the greatest tyranny, which then legitimates a general citizen revolt against the government. Friedrich Bastiat, the great French liberal, went even further. He argued that even a lawful, quote unquote, liberal order can be tyrannical. And he argued that the liberal constitutions of the budding democracies in the West had already committed this error. Quote, law has destroyed its own object. It has been employed in annihilating that justice which it ought to have established, in effacing amongst rights that limit which it was its true mission to respect. It has placed the collective force, that is to say, the monopoly of force, in the service of those who wish to traffic without risk and without scruple in the persons, the liberty, and the property of others. It has converted plunder into a right that it may protect it, and lawful defense into a crime that it may punish it. End of quote. A state of emergency only makes all of that worse, for whatever constitutional protections did remain for ordinary citizens, although he already considers them woefully inadequate, disappear entirely in the state of emergency. Okay. In The Road to Serfdom, the famous economist Friedrich Hayek wrote, quote, central planning leads to dictatorship because dictatorship is the most effective instrument of coercion and the enforcement of ideals. And as such, it is essential if central planning on a large scale is to be possible. End of quote. In other words, if bureaucrats are given central planning powers, dictatorship is likely. Yes, because this is concentration of power, and power tends to be abused. There is no greater concentration of power that a liberal democratic order can confer greater than the declaration of a state of emergency. Hayek is explicitly worried about socialism, but as noted earlier, communism is an extended full power state of emergency, or else the state of emergency is compressed communism. So following Hayek's own logic, the state of emergency is the greatest possible danger to a liberal democratic order. Robert Higgs writes, and I quote, each genuine crisis has been the occasion for another ratchet toward bigger government. The progressive ideological imperative that government must, quote unquote, do something, must take responsibility for resolving any perceived crisis, ensures new actions, end of quote. Here, Higgs echoes Hayek's preoccupation with the leftist view of state bureaucrats as our well-intentioned friends, who are therefore assumed to act with probity and compassion when we increase their powers in the hope that they will solve our problems. The difference is that Higgs is extending the argument beyond what you might technically call socialism or communism to indict all leftists who turn to the state to solve the problems of society. The problem with this idea is that, contrary to the naive belief of so many leftists, state bureaucrats are not by definition our friends, and the more power we give them, the more we necessarily corrupt them. Because this is an axiom, power is abused. Higgs refers us to the empirical result, historically documented. Every time leftists have argued for giving government more power to, quote unquote, solve a crisis, government has gotten, quote, bigger, unquote, meaning that the powers gained by government via the solve our crisis gambit are never relinquished. And each crisis thus harnessed by leftist ideologues produces greater and greater normalized concentration of power, which inevitably leads to tyranny. Since there is no greater perceived crisis than one employed to suspend a constitution, my own views here constitute the limiting case of Higgs's own argument. I'm going to leave it there. If you want to see how these arguments fit with the body of political thought that we have inherited from our most important theorists, I have a few other remarks that I will put into the article I'm going to publish on this question. The article will be available tomorrow on Substack, and we will also put the description of that, the link to that article in the description. And now we will go to the question and answers, the Q&A. Those of you who would like to be in the Q&A, please go to our Substack, the Management of Reality Substack, and join us as a paid subscriber, or if you're already a free subscriber, upgrade to paid, and then you will be able to see our latest post, which is on this very podcast, and you'll be able to see the link for the Zoom where we do the Q&A. All right. Thank you very much for joining us, and I'll see you next Thursday on our next English language podcast. Remember to subscribe, give us a like, hit the bell, and most of all, share this with the people you love, because we all need to do our little our grain of sand or our giant ball of sand, whatever your powers may be, to defend Western civilization. Thank you very much.